Well, I would like to begin by... does it work?
Yeah.
Okay. I would like to begin by recalling a certain data about the relationship Slavoj Žižek and I have, because it's quite strange in some way. For a long time, Žižek was just a name for me, and in the beginning he was the name of a translator, because he was the first translator, of course, in his own language, Slovenian, but he was also the first translator ever. At that time, I was at the beginning of my work, and before Žižek, nobody had translated anything. And it seemed to me, maybe I'm wrong, but this interest that came from what was at that time Yugoslavia was connected with the fact that Yugoslavia was a communist country, and on the one hand, and on the other hand, the other fact that in Paris at that time there was an attempt connected with Althusser to rebuild a Marxist approach that would avoid all the pitfalls of Stalinism, but also of the Italian version of Marxism. And so it's the reason why Žižek was interested by my work was not personal and in connection with me. To me, it may have been personal after that, but at the beginning, it was more connected with a general situation for intellectuals in a country like Yugoslavia, with respect to intellectuals, Marxist intellectuals in Paris. Of course, the situation changed a lot. Across history, Yugoslavia disappeared. Slavoj Žižek became a global philosopher, international philosopher, rather than a Slovenian philosopher. While myself remained a French philosopher. I mean, I was not. It was just like that. I was not very well known outside the national frontiers of France. But Žižek kept translating certain parts of my work or giving some signs of interest, but we never met. The first time we met was 2 years ago or 3 years ago.
In Ljubljana.
In Ljubljana. So this relationship is quite strange because on the one hand, it's very constant and close and connected with great events of what happened in Europe. The destruction of the classical communism, the attempt to rebuild communism in France, the idea that some people among which I was, that there was a possible connection between Marxism and Lacan's theory. So our relation was very close on the one hand, and very distant on the other hand, since we didn't know each other. And the first time Žižek didn't translate a text I wrote, but directly commented this text, it was in order to criticize me.
Of course.
So it's sort of an irony of history Hence, the question that was asked to me by you: do you loathe Slavoj Žižek? And my answer was that I understood why the question was raised. It was connected with superficial events, but it didn't take into account, because, of course, they were not known, the deepest factors of our relationship, and these deepest factors are connected with European history. History of Marxism, history of what happened in France during the 60s, and not French theory in the narrow sense, or French theory in a wider sense, and so on and so on. My own position is I could summarize it using the term unfaithfulness. I don't know if it exists. I'm not faithful to necessarily to what I have done during or written during my life. And of course, for instance, if you could read, you may read in English For the Love of Language. It has been translated. But as far as I know, les noms indistincts, the indistinct nouns have not been translated. You would have, I think, the same feeling that Žižek felt, had a sort of strange way of approaching language and relationship between language and things and thoughts. While on the other hand, what I'm writing today is quite different, because I'm talking or writing about factual events, namely French Revolution, or my very last book, which is a book of entretien, what is the English word for that? An exchange. Conversation, yes, with a journalist. The title is Considerations about France. It's about contemporary or present-day France. So it's empirical. Well, it was not the case with the book that Žižek mentioned. So there is a sort of unfaithfulness. But on the other hand, I think that let's call that a method. The method I used in my previous book and the method I use today are similar. So this unfaithfulness is like in marriage. It's another name for deep faithfulness. But of course, my partner in that case is something I wrote myself. So there is no question of divorce or alimony or things like that. Let's talk about this book, Relire la Révolution. Since it doesn't exist in English till now, I shall begin by summarize or underline certain points I think are important to me. The first thing, of course, is relire, read again. In the Read Again, where you have two words, you have to read and you have again. Why read? Why the question of reading is important for the French Revolution? For a reason, the fact that first of all, French revolutionaries didn't have to speak to parties because parties did not exist. And of course, especially not Bolshevized parties. If you think the major texts of Lenin or Mao Zedong are texts that are not addressed to the masses, but they are addressed to the party. They are, in fact, instruction given to the party in order that the intermediary member of the party would explain to the masses what is going on. This sort of double level structure did not exist in the French Revolution. The activity of the French revolutionaries was essentially to talk, and to talk aloud about politics. Aloud, that means that they could be heard by people who were there, who were, on the one hand, member of an assembly, but also because these sessions were always open, so including to women, so they were heard not only by professionals, let's say, but by ordinary people. That's one level. The second level was that every important discourse was published, printed. And at that time, it's a question that, of course, should be raised. How many people could read at that time? Well, the answer has been given quite recently, because a lot of people thought beforehand that a minority of people could read. But the answer is quite the reverse. At that time, the degree of the reading ability, I'm not talking about writing ability, the extension of the reading ability was so large that it was never reached again till the end of the 19th century in France. For many reasons connected with the way the church thought it necessary for Christians to read fluently, and so on and so on. And the lower church, I mean, the priests of the small villages were quite revolutionary in their ideas. Of course, after that, you had a rupture between the Catholic priests and the revolution. At the beginning, it was not the case. So you have really, through the text, a direct connection, more direct that it was possible in Russia or in China. A direct connection with every important discourse at that time. So to read this text is important. And of course, I just made an allusion, the fact that these texts that were public about politics is quite a new thing, because for a long time, politics were a secret affair. Someone like Montesquieu wrote about politics, L'Esprit des Lois, the spirit of the laws. I don't know what the English classical translation is. But it has been shown that Montesquieu wrote in a way that Leo Strauss has analyzed. Of course, he wrote in an indirect way. And it was a way of writing about politics at that time. While during the French Revolution, from the beginning, people wrote directly, not in an indirect way, but directly. When they thought that the king should be demoted, they said so. They didn't use metaphors or didn't use parables, and they talked directly about institutions and changes that should be made. Why read again? It's connected with an hypothesis. The hypothesis that between the French Revolution and the present-day reader, especially in Europe, something functions as a sort of screen, a sort of intermediary screen, which I call in French la croyance révolutionnaire, the revolutionary belief. And this belief has several interesting features. The first feature is the idea that there are a finite set of revolutions that could be called major revolutions. And this finite set, in fact, includes French Revolution, Soviet Revolution, Chinese Revolution. You may add, according to your preferences, the Cuban Revolution or other events. But the three revolutions I quoted are generally considered as the major revolutions. Second, people think that these revolutions are, in fact, ordered. The second one, namely the Soviet Revolution, is a way of rebuilding what had been achieved by the first one, namely the French Revolution, and in order to go further. And of course, the main point is the question of property. The French Revolution included property in the rights of man, human rights, while the Soviet Revolution did not include them in the human rights. Well, they didn't speak of human rights, but they considered private property as something that should be destroyed. So the idea is that one step forward was made. So of course this ordering is an ordering that goes in a progressive way. The second revolution goes further than the first one. And the third revolution, when I was a Maoist, it was very clear that the third revolution, namely the Chinese Revolution, went a step forward with respect to the second one. And in fact, if you read the Chinese text, it's exactly the position that the Chinese had, that considered the Russian Revolution as incomplete because it could not prevent what they called the new Tsars, namely Khrushchev, Brezhnev, and so on. So there was in the second revolution the possibility of being weakened. This possibility was to be fought against by the Third Revolution. And inside the Chinese Revolution, Anna Badiou distinguishes the first Chinese Revolution and the second Chinese Revolution, namely the Cultural Revolution. I'm not sure that he's right, but that's not the point. He's right in thinking that the Cultural Revolution thought that it made a step forward with respect to the first half of the Chinese Revolution. The first half of the Chinese Revolution was dominated by the Communist Party. The Cultural Revolution made a step forward by substituting communes to the party. Shanghai Commune, Peking Commune, and so on, so on, and so on. It's a very difficult question, but the idea is there. This conception of linear order, which is also progress, makes no sense if you don't believe in a final goal which may have not been reached yet, or you may believe it has been reached. For instance, when I was a Maoist, we strongly believed that the Cultural Revolution was reaching this final end, which is not the, let's say, the class, the society without classes, but the revolution that will, the last revolution that will produce that. I call this supposition the ideal of revolution. There is an ideal which, like in a classical painting, you have perspective points that organizes the whole painting. Well, in the revolutionary belief, you have a point, an ideal point, which is the ideal of revolution, that organizes all the history of mankind, in fact, and all the main events of this history, the main events of this history for someone who believes in revolutions. These main events are precisely the major revolutions. But if you believe that, well, of course, I'm not. I have to add that this conception was represented very early by Marx himself, and the Marxist language, as opposed to other languages about revolution, for instance, the anarchist language. The Marxist language was, in fact, a sort of theoretical, gave to this revolutionary belief a grammar, a lexicon, a syntax, and, in fact, a dictionary. So there was a deep connection between the revolutionary belief and the primacy, is that an English word? The primacy of the Marxist language, the Marxist way of speaking about reality. This primacy that Žižek and I knew, it was still in force in Europe during the 60s. For instance, Wittfogel wrote a book about the Oriental despotism, and in his second edition, which was late 50s or in the 60s, I don't remember exactly, he says that Marxism was now the lingua franca of the learned world, as, let's say, Aristotle had been in the Middle Ages. It was impossible to talk about any social or historical event, at least in Europe, in Western Europe, without using this Marxist language. And this Marxist language was impossible to disconnect from the revolutionary belief. And the revolutionary belief was impossible to disconnect from the Marxist language. A consequence of this situation was that it was impossible to read French Revolution, since the reading was in a certain way predetermined. It was impossible to read the text as they were written, because they were always read, let's say, belatedly. The main example, I quote it, I comment it in my book. The night of the 14th of July, the Bastille Day, the king, who had not been informed, he didn't know what happened. It happened in Paris. The king was in Versailles. He had spent the day in hunting, so nobody around him thought it advisable to tell him that something had happened in Paris. And one nobleman, who was in fact in charge of the hunting, very important nobleman, thought that it was impossible, that the king should be advised. And he used all his privileges to get to the king, who was in his bed eating, because he ate at every hour of the day. And he was a very big man, more than 6 feet, very, very strong. So, well, and you have this exchange of words, which is quite interesting. Well, the Duke explains to the king what happened in Paris, the Bastille, what happened around the Bastille, which was quite violent. And the king says, well, c'est une révolte. It is a revolt. A revolt. And the answer is no, sir, it is a revolution. Of course, it's quite interesting. But the question is, what do they mean? If we read this exchange now, we feel that we understand what is at stake. Because we think that the Duke used revolution in the way we use it now, as if he was, in fact, predicting what would happen several years after, including the death of the king himself. But of course, it makes no sense. So the question is, it's a very simple question about one word, but the question should be raised about every sentence of every discourse during the French Revolution. Nobody at that time could speak about politics and know what would happen the following month. Let's not talk about the following years. So what did the Duke have in mind? What did the king have in mind? Because the king understood. So there is a research which is quite philological in that sense. I would say that I remain faithful to my interest for nouns. What are the philological basis for the use of the word revolution at a time when the French Revolution had not existed? So that's one research I had to make. It was quite philological, but it had political consequences. Because from that word only, by extending what happened for that unique word to the whole sentences that were uttered during the French Revolution, you begin by understanding that the French Revolution should be read in an autonomous way, in the same way that, for instance, Spinoza says, well, you have to explain the scriptures by the scriptures, or Jacques-Alain Miller says that Lacan must be explained by Lacan. Well, the French Revolution must be explained by the French Revolution itself. As all political events should be explained, in fact. What I'm trying to do about the French Revolution should be done about the Soviet Revolution and should be done about the Chinese Revolution, of course, but not taking into account what happened during the French Revolution. Trotsky, for instance, is quite convinced at each moment of the Soviet Revolution that they are repeating the French Revolution. The Tsar is like the French king. The Tsarin is like the French Queen, Marie Antoinette. The Mensheviks are like the Girondins. The Bolsheviks are like the Jacobins. Lenin has some features of Robespierre. He himself has some features of Saint-Just, and so on and so on.
And Stalin is Thermidor, no?
Of course.
Yeah.
Of course. He says so explicitly. A lot of writing by Trotsky are based on this repetition. Of course, that's precisely the way to not understand what happened. So I leave aside the question of the Soviet Revolution because it's not what about that I wrote. But nevertheless, you have to keep in mind that this rereading of revolutions in plural should be done for all major revolutions. So, by doing that work, well, first thing, I thought that the common basis that enabled people to understand what the word revolution meant at that time, although the revolution itself was just beginning, was a Greek historian named Polybius. This Greek historian has a theory that tremendously important. It is the basis of, let's say, the whole political philosophy till the modern times. You find it in Cicero, you find it in Machiavel, you find it in Montesquieu. The idea is that you have basically three types of regime, and the principle is the number of people that hold the power. One, many, all. One, monarchy. Many, aristocracy or oligarchy. All, democracy. But, and this system is connected with a necessity of evolution. The most natural, direct regime is a regime of the power of the one. In fact, if you read Freud, for instance, you find, I don't think Freud thought of Polybius, but he had the same idea. The most natural regime is a regime where the father has all the power. In fact, in Tartare Ben Taboo is Polybian without knowing it. So, the most simple, immediate form of power is the power of one. But this power goes to the strongest, the most wise, the wisest, but of course, we are among men are mortals, so this wise man or strong man who holds the power is respected by everyone. Well, he dies, and he has followers. And the follower he has, the unique follower he has, since it is a monarchy, is not necessarily worthy of the power. So the possibility of a decay of the monarchy is always possible, is always open. The decay of the monarchy is called the tyranny. In order to struggle and to triumph from the disorders and violences of the tyranny, well, the people is rebellious and gives the power to a small group of the wisest and the strongest. Several, a little group, the best. So if they are the best, you have the aristocracy. Aristos means the best in Greek. Few of them, oligos in Greek, means a few, oligarchy. And so you have a solution. But the solution is also subjected to the decay, because the sons of the wisest are not necessarily wise. So you have the decay of aristocracy in something that is not aristocracy, but precisely oligarchy, where the few who govern, who have the power, do not use the power for the best of all, but for their own benefit. In order to, then you have a revolt, rebellion, and now comes the solution of the all. democracy. The old name in Greek of the political all is demos, democracy. But it's possible that at one time the people, the demos, doesn't use the power in the interest of all, but in the interest of a sub-part of the all that is the people, as opposed to the other member of the people who are, for instance, the rich or the best born and so on and so on. So the democracy becomes something else. The power of the people becomes the power of the crowd, and the Greek name for the crowd is oklos, hence ochlocracy. This distinction in three types, doubled by three decade form, and the idea that you have a cycle that goes from one to several to all, and each time the change has caused a decaying of the preceding form. This representation is the basis of almost all political philosophy in the Western world. And it's quite interesting, not only from a philological point of view, but also from a historical point of view, to notice that the revolutionaries themselves in France were convinced that that would happen if they were not careful. It's a cycle. So the idea, for Robespierre says, when the assembly is on the point to take a decision, which was in fact catastrophic, since the decision was to enter into the war against all Europe. He says, well, if you do so, the revolution is ended, the people will not have the power will go to a general, a victorious general. Of course, what is remarkable is that it happens exactly like that. Napoleon was just a victorious general at the beginning. So this Polybian representation was deeply ingrained in the mind of the revolutionaries, but also it seemed to be confirmed by the turn of the events. If I had time, I would like to comment two things that French Revolution, or three things that revolution did. One thing is a reflection that seems to be accepted by everyone today, but is not. It seems to be understood by everyone today, but is not, namely a reflection about the distinction between droits de l'homme, rights of men, not human rights. The difference between noun and adjective is important. Droits de l'homme et droits du citoyen. The idea that the conditions for being a human being, an homme, are not the same as a condition for being a citizen. This entails very, very deep reflection, which has been almost completely forgotten, which has been criticized, in my opinion, in an unjust way, essentially by Hannah Arendt, who is the most brilliant critic of this conception. And I wrote the whole chapter about that in order to make clear that not only political action, but also political theory was the center of the French Revolution. The second thing is a question of terror. La terreur under a lot of people in France, maybe elsewhere, consider that the Terreur and Robespierre are in fact the ancestors of Stalinism. If you read carefully what happened, it appears, two things appears. One thing is that terror was divided in two types for someone like Robespierre. You had the terror by the crowd, which was the political absolute evil, and the terror by the law, which could be necessary at certain times. And the terror by the law was decided precisely in order to stop the terror by the crowd. The terror by the crowd was, to Robespierre's mind, to Danton's mind, to all people who were at that time active, was the beginning of ochlocracy. And since they were plebeian in their mind, that was the end of the revolution and, of course, the beginning of a new monarchy that would be either the return of the previous royal family, or worse, the power of any general. And you had a lot of generals at that time, because it was a war. So a lot of comments about the terror do not make this distinction. And although Hegel wrote one of the deepest texts about the terror in the phenomenology, he himself did not make this distinction. The terror by the crowd, without the law, or external to the law, was represented by, for instance, the drownings of Nantes, where people in charge of the terror built up boats with a removable bottom, yes, and priests, noblemen, but also very ordinary people, people who had been denounced by their neighbors, were by 20 or 30 were on the boat. And when the boat arrived in the middle of of the La Loire, the river, the bottom open, and they drowned. Robespierre thought that it was absolutely criminal, because it was quite the contrary of what he had in mind when he thought about terror. For him, the terror was something that should be accomplished by a trial. And of course, at that time, death penalty was usual in all European countries, not only in France. And at that time, the most, quote marks, humane way of putting someone to death was considered to be the guillotine, because it lasted one instant. It was a machine. It did not depend on an individual called le bourreau, and so on and so on. So, the guillotine. And it is very interesting in Hegel's text that he considers as equivalent both types of death, the death by drowning and the death by guillotine. That means that he himself had not captured the deep distinction between the two types of terror, terror by the crowd and terror by the trial, by the law. Nevertheless, one has to wonder, why did Robespierre and others, but essentially Robespierre, did he consider terror as necessary? And why did he consider that at one moment suspicion was sufficient rather than proof? You have to ask something, you have to raise a question, but not without underlining the fact that the whole process of Robespierre's terror lasts 1 year. It's not a way of governing people. It's not a government. There is no government by terror. The terror is something that is necessity that makes government impossible, as opposed to the Stalinian terror, which is a way of governing. The Stalinist terror lasts for decades, let's say. And in fact, the Stalinist government is a government where terror is a mean of governing. In the case of Robespierre, his conclusion, we may not agree with that conclusion, his conclusion was that the situation was a war. Not only was it a war, but it was a war such that everyone could be a traitor because money was everywhere in order to pay traitors. He thought and concluded that governing a country was at that time impossible without terror. But terror was in fact, in his own mind, the contrary of a government, as opposed to the Stalinist conception. The last point, scandalous to some, I made. The preceding point was scandalous to some people, but not the same people. Because to be for or against Robespierre is still an open question in France. The idea is that Robespierre was not fascinated by death, but was reasoning in political terms in a situation where politics became, to his own mind, impossible because of the war. Is, of course, a contradiction in terms. It's, in fact, already a dialectical situation. But, of course, Robespierre did not think in terms of dialectics. It was either or. That the terror, the Robespierre terror, in terms of either or, is very difficult to capture. But nevertheless, that's the way he thought of it. What the third point I made, which was scandalous to some, not the same, I repeat, was the fact that I connected one very essential feature of French Revolution with the status it recognized to the right of property. As remember, the Soviet Revolution and the Chinese Revolution thought that private property should disappear, and that it was a limitation of the French Revolution to have thought of a solution in terms of property. But on the other hand, what is very seldom underlined is that French Revolution solved a question that had been unsolved, that remained unsolved in Europe since the Roman Empire. That is the question of the property of the soil. The notion of paysan, peasant, is a notion that has no meaning in France before French Revolution. Before French Revolution, the notion was fermier, farmer, métayer, various terms. In other terms, people who worked on the soil but did not own the soil and paid a certain fee, either in money or in
kind?
Well, in
you mean 10% of the product they return to the... Yeah.
Yes, but
also in work, no?
In work, in product, in fact. In fruits, well, some the best solution was a solution of farming. Farming, in a narrow sense, a farmer is someone who pays in money, as opposed to the métayer who pays in product. And the fermier could expect to become reasonably have a good situation, while the métayer could not expect that. So, but in general, the fact was that the owner of the soil did not work on the soil, and those who worked on the soil did not own the soil. The situation was the normal situation in Europe since the Roman Empire, and in fact since the Roman Republic, since the instability of the Roman Republic was based on that precisely. The French Revolution, for the first time in European history, built up a program. Of course, it was not effective immediately, but built up a program where the ideal was that people who worked on the soil were also owner of the soil. That is the narrow sense of paysan. When Balzac wrote a novel whose title was Les Paysans, he described a new class of society, which was this class of people who owned the soil, worked the soil, and could become rich by doing so, which was, in Balzac's conception, quite scandalous. Thought that richness without instruction or without nobility, just based on the fact that you owned the soil and worked on the soil, was a bad richness. So his book about, his novel about Les Paysans is quite interesting to read, because it explains, that's the reason why Marx admired it so much, it explained why peasantry in France ceased to be a revolutionary class. It ceased to be a revolutionary class because the agrarian question had been solved. And in fact, as opposed to the Soviet and Chinese revolution, which are characterized by the fact that they did not find any solution for peasantry, and on the contrary, created terrible situations for peasantry with terrible consequences, not only consequences in terms of simple life, but also consequences from an ecological point of view. I recently learned that in Ukraine, since the antiquity, you had a certain earth called black earth, Chernozem. It was very fertile because you had something like 15 meters of earth. While, for instance, in the most fertile part of France, you have something like 5 or 4 meters of soil. Well, now in Ukraine, the soil has disappeared. The wind has blown over everything because of the type of culture, because of the consequence of the fact that nobody thought the earth as something that he was responsible of. And of course, morally speaking, you may regret it, but in order to make someone responsible for the soil, one way is to make him the proprietor of the soil. That's the solution that the French Revolution built up, with, in fact, very short circulation. Of course, this situation is not true anymore, but for 1 century at least, it existed. It seems to me that you cannot approach the question of private property without raising the question of the soil. If you do not do so, well, the result is, to me, unavoidable. What happened in Soviet Union, in fact, to destruction of the Russian peasantry, which became, well, with massacres and so on and so on, but at the end became a sort of variable of adjustment for policies that were defined every 5 years. Contradictory objectives were fixed to the peasantry. It didn't work. And worse, the Chinese solution, which now has produced the fact that Chinese peasantry has been deported massively, has become a lumpenproletariat surrounding the cities. The soil has been covered in many places by water with huge dams. And all that because the question that the French Revolution had raised, people who worked on the soil have a right to become owner of the soil. This question has not been raised, and has not been raised by the notion of being proprietor of something had completely disappeared. So what was scandalous for some was the fact that I consider that the French Revolution were right, including the right of property among the rights of man. And that does not entail necessarily that capitalism is a part of the rights of man. There is a sharp distinction between the property, the rights of individual property, and the non-individual property, which characterizes, on the contrary, capitalism.